Hello everyone. Welcome, good morning. Welcome to this Wheeler Centre event. I'm Ramona Koval, and today it's my great pleasure to be once again speaking with writer Janette Turner Hospital. In 1978, she published her first short story in the Atlantic Monthly. Now, that's a pretty amazing beginning for a writer. And she's gone on to have great success all throughout her career. She's won many awards. She has been Distinguished Professor of English at the University of South Carolina, and now she's Distinguished Professor Emerita there. She still has things to do with students, and she teaches a little bit, but she's been devoting her time, and this book, as she'll explain to you, has taken many, many years of effort and energy, and I can tell you it was well worth the time and the energy she spent on it. It's a hard novel to summarise, The Claimant, and I should say it's also an international conspiracy thriller in a way too, so I don't want to give too much away, and I don't want to ruin your enjoyment once you get your hands on the book after we speak today. But the book posed some very intriguing questions for me. It's concerned with the way our identities change, even in the simplest way, depending on where we are in our lives and who we're with and what the expectations are of people that we are with. Our class, our politics, our nationalities. It's told in an incredibly complex way, and later on I want to talk to Janette about how she actually went about keeping all of the strands in her head. It's a book about spies and collaborators, about art and religion, and its setup is a fictional court case in the late 20th century over a family fortune and the search for a lost heir. But to begin today, we're going to have a lovely experience of hearing Janette Turner Hospital do a reading from The Claimant. Please welcome her to Melbourne.
Thank you very much, Ramona, and thank you all of you for coming. I loved my last Wheeler Centre appearance, and you know, Melbourne is where I started out. I was born in Melbourne and spent the first 7 years of my life here. And now I've lived in 6 countries and don't really know where I come from anymore, although I think of myself basically as a Queenslander because I moved there at 7. Okay, although this is based on the Tichborne Claimant case of the 19th century, it's pretty much set in the present. The Claimant was supposedly born in New York to one of the richest and most powerful Protestant families in America. But he was French and Catholic on his mother's side, and of aristocratic descent, offspring of a long line of erotic and sumptuous extramarital beddings that stretched back to Louis XIV. He grew up in a village in France, in the chateau that dominated a cluster of vineyards, and he was fluent in French. No, he was Australian and sounded Australian. When he opened his mouth, the muddy diphthongs of Crocodile Dundee oozed out, sluggish as the chocolate custard left behind by a river after floods. No, he was blue-collar American, who enlisted in December 1968, just before Christmas, was promptly shipped off to basic training at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, and then to a short advanced training stint in California, and then to Vietnam, after which he was either killed, or was missing in action, or was protected by South Vietnamese villagers who became boat people and eventually made their way to Australia, or he was evacuated to the Philippines after the fall of Saigon in 1975, after which he made his way to Australia, perhaps with the dog tags and ID of a fallen Aussie soldier, whom he may perhaps have tried to save, or may have killed. Of the few things known for certain, one was at the time of being purportedly located by the Vanderbilt lawyers, the Claimant was a cattleman and butcher in a small town in Queensland, Australia. He had been there since the mid-70s and was going by the name of Christy McClue, accepted by the locals as prototypically Irish Australian. Would the real Claimant please stand up, ran the tabloid headlines. Which persona is the actual fake? Was it just possible, some op-ed writers surmised, that he was the genuine article, an authentic offshoot of the vast and branchy Vanderbilt tree, so many of whose saplings sprouted from serial nuptials, rogue dalliances, and dangerous forays into weed patches beyond the walls of family estates? When Vanderbilt sowers went forth to sow, they scattered their seed as lavishly as they scattered their fortunes. If even the family could not keep track, how could the lawyers? In short, would the jury award the claimant a lavish penthouse on Fifth Avenue with a view of Central Park, a mansion on Long Island, a mansion in need of repairs and under a certain degree of duress from several banks and mortgage companies, a lifetime annuity, title to the Vanderbilt widow's chateau in the Loire Valley, and legal entitlement to the name? Or would they send the claimant to jail? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, as you've made clear, it's not set in the 19th century where the Tichborne claimant case was placed, but just refresh our memories about that particular case, because it's quite an emblem, isn't it, of this kind of case?
Yes, and I actually first heard of the Tichborne claimant at an academic conference in the US. An American scholar gave a paper. Her field was Victorian literature, late 19th century, and she gave a paper on Victorian England's anxiety about fraud. There was lots of it going on. You know, there was overseas speculation, scams. There was adulteration of food and milk, and there was the case of the Tichborne claimant, whom I'd never heard of, which she described as sort of the epitome of this anxiety about fraud. The Tichborne claimant at the time, he was the real heir, and it's still not known if the claimant really might have been the real heir or not. He was found to be a fraud and spent a decade in jail. But it became the cause célèbre of both the Australian and the British press in the 1890s. And it came to be all tangled up with imperial colonial points of view. The thing was that the Earl of Tichborne married a bewitchingly beautiful French woman who was supposedly descended from one of Louis XIV's mistresses, but of course on the wrong side of the sheet. So the mistress back in the 16th century was given a chateau which passed on down through, as the locals said, a long line of well-kept whores. And so the claimant's mother was part of aristocratic society, but always bitter that she was not recognized as such. She was also hyper-devoutly and neurotically Catholic. And after she married and was taken off to the Tichborne estates in the middle of England, she just was bored out of her skull by hunting parties and British aristocrats. So she took her infant son back to Paris, and she dressed him. Now, mind you, this was not uncommon in the late 19th century for little boys of infancy to be dressed in dresses. But she kept him in a dress. And his father, at a certain point, didn't want a, wimpy French son who spoke French, so he yanked him away. He went to visit his father and was never allowed to return. And he was sent to a British boarding school, and we all know how cruel and terrible they can be, especially to this weak little kid who spoke English very poorly. So as soon as he could, he ran away to sea from both parents, but was in a ship that unfortunately sank off the coast of Brazil in 1857, I think it was. But there were rumors that some of the survivors had been picked up by an Australian ship and taken to Australia. So when the Earl of Tichborne died, his mother, grief-stricken, advertised in papers all over Australia to say that, maybe he's alive somewhere there, doesn't remember who he is. He's now the heir to all these estates. Well, this is what became a cause tabloid sensation, because the Australian press were just, I think, quite rightly furious that these snobby Brits couldn't believe that a New South Wales butcher could possibly be the heir to British estate and British fortune. So they took it up as a colonial cause against these snobby Brits. And the Brits, of course, by this time, the Claimant was a shambling, overweight, ill-mannered hulk who apparently couldn't remember any French and spoke with a broad ochre accent. So they absolutely knew he couldn't possibly be the real heir. And it dragged on for a decade through the courts, and he was found to be a fraud. So that's the story behind it. And for me, the starting point was, and I'm not going to go into, because there's a wonderful book being published in Australia by Robin Annear, published by Text Publishing in Melbourne, that the whole amazing story of the Tichborne case. But there's just enough in there that I thought, maybe he really was the heir but didn't want to be. He didn't want to go back. Now, I have no idea. I hope DNA will eventually answer that question. But that was just, in my mind, the starting point. But I didn't want to write a historical novel. I wanted to move it to the present. And the Vanderbilt family in the US, actually infinitely richer than the Earl of Tichborne would ever have been, and owned property all over the place in Manhattan and on Long Island and in the Hamptons. So I made it the Vanderbilt case.
So I thought, as I'm reading it, how do the Vanderbilts feel about this book?
Well, I guess I've yet to find out.
But then I thought, well, okay, tell me about how you just, because you're right about the Vanderbilts. Is it the Cabots or Cabot?
The Cabot. They pronounce it Cabot. The Cabots are old New England money, Boston money. There's a jingle in Boston that the two aristocratic old money families were the Lowells and the Cabots. And we lived in Boston for a number of years when we first went to the US, and everyone would say this little jingle, "Hail to the city of Boston, home of the baked bean and cod, where Lowells speak only to Cabots and Cabots speak only to God."
But so as a writer, you think, okay, I'm going to make this stuff up about these people who are related to this family. What's the legal position?
Well, I was worried about that, although I've read, there was a wonderful book by Joyce Carol Oates. You remember this, when Edward Kennedy was having an affair.
Blackwater, I think it
yes,
was called.
She called it Blackwater, which I think is a brilliant novella. Yeah. And the character, I don't know if you remember this story, but they were going across a bridge and they were both very drunk. And
Mary Jo Kopechne.
The car went off the bridge. He got out and swam away and waited 24 hours before he did anything, before he reported it. And the thing that's always appalled me is that apparently she, locked into the car, would have stayed alive in a pocket of air for a couple of hours, which I can't imagine what kind of hell that would be. Somehow the Kennedys, they emerged relatively unscathed from all of this. And Joyce Carol Oates wrote a novella about it in which this main character is only ever called the Senator and not named as Edward Kennedy. And I always thought, how did she get away with it? Because I know how cautious publishers are about possible legal proceedings. So there have been a couple of books like that, and I made sure that I say at the end that although the Vanderbilt history and Cabot history is well known, the Vanderbilts and Cabots in my novel are entirely the product of my imagination. So I'm hoping that will be sufficient legal protection. I did ask my publishers, to talk to the lawyers to see if there was any risk. My husband was a lot more worried about it than I was and said, "You've got to check this out. We don't want to be sued, for
I think actually that the Vanderbilts have got so much sort of messy history, which is all true.
Certainly do.
I don't think they're going to sort of raise an eyebrow, really.
Right. And I would figure that's what saved Joyce Carol Oates, was Edward Kennedy, who did go on to sort of redeem himself as a very fine senator. Would he want to remind the whole world about this very, very shabby drowning where he leaves a young woman with whom he's having an affair to drown in a car? you probably can count on the fact that they're not going to want to sue.
I think Joyce Carol Oates said that actually nobody read that book very much, so it really didn't
I did.
have...
I taught it. I thought it was brilliant.
Yeah, I read it, but it was it wasn't a great success for her, so I don't think that it was on everybody's lips as much as you'd hope.
That's probably true, yeah.
So, when you talked about the Titchborough and Claimant, there are elements of that case that really appealed to you. The mother who was obsessed with religion, and something that I was going to talk about was the art of butchery, because your guy in as you've read, that part of the theory was this guy. He was a butcher too,
and a very skillful one. Whereas apparently the Titchborough Claimant, who did become a butcher in the great city of Wagga Wagga in New South Wales, was literally a bit of a butcher. I mean, he was apparently a very bad and clumsy one. And I wanted a much more interesting character than that.
And I mean, butchery is, it's really about, the art of trying to find all the different parts of the animal and how to cut through the animal without hacking, and having, there's a lot in the book about parts of eating tongue, about telling people things and not telling people things. So I wanted you to explain to me about butchery and you. I mean,
why?
Because it seems to have stimulated a lot of ideas in you, the idea of a butcher.
And, I mean, I'm young enough, and probably many people here remember as a kid being given money by my mother and having to walk about a quarter of a mile down to the butcher's shop and specifically ask for cuts. And you didn't usually see the butcher actually cut them up, although sometimes you did. So, I'm old enough to have remembered when you didn't buy meat in cellophane packs in supermarkets. You actually went to the butchers and they were cut up. But also, the high school I went to in Brisbane was really an outer suburb of Brisbane on the edge of dairy country and rainforest country. And my closest friend in high school, we've always stayed in touch, she grew up on a small farm, and after adulthood she became a teacher, and she taught near Gatton, which is where the agricultural college is on the Darling Downs, and I used to stay with her, and she lived sort of as her own subsistence farmer until very recently, until she just got too old to get up at the crack of dawn every morning and milk her own cow. But she had a few cattle, and so I learned a lot from her. And every time, things like what's done to ensure against cattle ticks now, she could give me the latest information on what you do about that. But I have to admit, a lot of it, I went to videos. I Googled on, there are descriptions. I feel like I actually could cut up a side of beef now because I watched all these YouTube videos giving you information on how you do it. And a really fine butcher, apart from when they hang up the carcass at the beginning and they have to use a boning saw to cut down the middle of the spine, after that, a really fine butcher sort of intuits the spaces between the bones, and that's where the boning knife goes, and they don't chop at the bones. And so it's really a rather beautiful art form if it's done well, and I got fascinated by that, and watched a lot of these videos and wrote as though he was that kind of skillful butcher. But never done it myself.
What is the meaning of butchery, though? What ideas does it evoke in you?
Well, of course, we use the word butchery in a very derogatory way, don't we? I mean, Hitler was a butcher, Stalin was a butcher. We have a negative connotation to it. And yet, I have an epigraph in the book about Cliff Remite Chuang Tzu, a Chinese philosopher who felt that the proper way to cut up an animal is an art form, and if you do it properly, you can use the same knife for 10 years without sharpening it because you're not blunting it against the bone. And so I guess I wanted to convey that things we take for granted or think negatively about or don't think about much at all things can be done as an art form and with beauty, and that's one of the things I wanted to convey.
The other thing that it made me think about was that when you lay out an animal on a butcher's table, you see all the different parts and how they're related to each other and how they work, and then you imagine this as formerly a live creature. And the book is about identity and all the things that make up us as human beings, as who we are, kind of like putting things together, all the different elements together. And back to the idea of a claimant and who is a person. How do we know who people are? How do we know who they say they are, if that's the case? And you've written about other cases. I mean, there have been many throughout, the newspapers have covered people who assume the role of missing people, sometimes not to claim anything, but just to be somebody new.
As I got beyond my initial idea that, what if he really was there and didn't want to be, the book sort of morphed into a study of identity and why people change their identities. As far as I can tell, but this might be because these are the ones that come to our attention, it's for nefarious criminal reasons. Con men change their identity all the time. They become whatever suits the occasion. But it's not always the case. And at the same time as I was beginning to think about the Tichborne case, there was a case in South Carolina, where I now live, where a young woman in her 20s is currently in prison in South Carolina. This was written up in Harper's and the New Yorker, and I read about it. In fact, Cliff showed it to me and said, "Look, this is totally the same area as your case." The subject of the articles were the girl who conned the Ivy League. Now, the Ivy League, are the top universities in America: Harvard, Yale, Princeton. Very hard to get into. It's an amazing story. It's just as amazing as the Tichborne Claimant story, actually. She was one of, I think it was 8 children born in a rural farm in Montana, which is like coming from the Northern Territory. And her mother had several men in her life, so she had half-siblings. And it was hard-scrabbled poor, and this girl felt that she just didn't belong anywhere. I mean, she had these changing stepfathers, and her mother was not in great shape to be a good mother. And so she ran away, and the first time she did it, she stole the wallet of a friend of her sister's and used her driver's license as her new identity. And then she was very, very smart, this kid. I don't know genetically where this came from, given her background, but she was very, very bright. And she somehow found out that they don't do this anymore, but they used to actually put the social security numbers of missing people and their birth date, and that you could get a list of this online. So she would pick either dead or missing people who really were close in age to her own. And then she, very cleverly, she found out the states where it was easiest to get a driver's license without a great deal. She would write away and she would get the birth certificate of this missing person. She would say that she'd lost it or had been stolen. She would get that. Then she would use that to get a driver's license in that name. And, she moved around the country to the states where it was easiest to do this. But she had to do this several times because something would come up and she would be afraid that she'd be caught out as not being who her documentation said she was. But she was always doing it. She never did it for financial gain. She never did it to fleece people. She just really did it to escape from herself. She always felt that she was not the hand she was dealt, the family she was born into. So she changed identity altogether because she had to. She'd get scared and she'd pick out a new name. She did it 4 or 5 times. She took a summer school or an evening course at Harvard, did extremely well on it, used the fact that she so impressed the professor to get a reference, and eventually she got herself into Princeton because she really was very bright, and she would get A's on these courses. And if you take, and this is still so, if you just take an individual course and pay for it at a university, you don't have to go through all the business of meeting the admission requirements. And if you do this a few times and do very well, you package together some very good references from some prominent academic figures. And she did this. So she got herself into Princeton. And this is finally why she's in a jail in South Carolina. She changed, it was her last change of identity. And the one she picked was the identity of a young woman named Brooke Henson, who lived in South Carolina, disappeared after a party where people got very drunk, and it was always believed that her boyfriend, who was prone to terrible fits of temper, murdered her. But there was no proof of that, no body was ever found. And so Brooke Henson, the real South Carolina girl, had been missing for about a decade. So she took that identity. By sheer chance, a cop in South Carolina who had never let this case drop saw a reference to, in a newspaper or New York Times or somewhere, to Brooke Henson at Princeton. And just on the off chance, he called the university because he'd always felt for the parents that he wanted to find this, at least find out what happened to their missing daughter. So he called, and campus security called this woman, whose real name was Esther Reed, called and said, are you the Brooke Henson from South Carolina? And she said yes, and by the time the campus police got to her apartment, she'd cleared out again, because she knew the game was up. She actually lived on the run for about a year, pretty much on the street. She would stay in flea bag motels because she now had no identity she dared to use and no money. And eventually this very persistent cop from South Carolina found her, and she was tried and found guilty because it is a felony to steal someone's identity, and it put the parents of the missing girl through hell. Maybe she was alive after all, maybe not. So she's serving a prison sentence, but she never did it to, fleece people for money or for criminal gain. So those were kind of the two poles of my novel, on my assumption that maybe the Tichborne claimant really was the heir, but had had such a miserable time with both his parents he didn't want to be, and this girl in South Carolina who took multiple identities but not for criminal purposes. So ultimately I wanted 4 people, all of them shapeshifters, all of them identity changes, 2 of them very deliberately for criminal reasons, the con man and a con woman. And I have these 4 lives intertwining.
And, with the identity cases, I mean, often, just interesting that people who have lost children want to believe so much that they are not dead, that they will kind of identify the person who claims as one of them when it turns out to be completely not the case.
Yeah, well, in the original Tichborne one, the mother, who had been grieving for all these years and refused ever to believe that her son was dead. Now, her son, as he took off, ran away to sea, was a frail, nerdy-looking little guy who spoke very poor English and very good French. The Tichborne claimant, as he was eventually, by lots of Australian supporters who could see that there might be financial gain in this if their cobber in the butcher shop, turned out to come into a lot of money. So really, they they pushed him and they raised the money for him to go to England. By this time, he could speak no French at all, if he was the heir. He could speak no French at all. He was a great, shambling, obese, vulgar hulk of a man. But the amazing thing was that his mother instantly recognized him. And of course, the rest of the Tichborne family said, well, either this was a sort of insanity due to grief, that she just wanted to have her son back, or she wanted to make sure the inheritance stayed in the family and that she kept the family estates. So there are all kinds of reasons to argue that obviously he was not the heir, and that's what the courts found. But, changing body shape, it's happened to all of us probably. We put on weight, we take weight off. It's not impossible that he really was the heir but didn't want to be. Anyway, that was my supposition when I started.
Well, changes of name abound in this book, and as a reader, I've been making notes about who starts off like this, and
everybody
got a
changes name multiple
this one's got
times.
Another name, and you do it very subtly. So suddenly, somebody comes into the scene with one name, but something happens and they leave the scene with another name. But I think you say that this had to be sort of set in the late 90s, really, because it may not be as possible to get away with it right now. And
that's right.
What's the difference?
Well, because everyone has to have a social security number now, and in Australia, what's it called here? I can't forget because I've got an American social security number.
Well, we've got a Medicare card.
No, but for your tax ID.
Oh, yeah, it's a tax file number.
Right, okay.
If you pay
well,
tax.
in the US, this SSN, your social security number, is sort of an all-purpose identifier. You have to have it to get a driver's license when you file tax. And to get someone else's, there's no way to do it without committing a felony. You're finding out the social security number of a dead or a missing person, and that's a felony. There is actually one way, and the girl I talked about, did do it once. If you can argue to, I don't know whether you argue to the police or to the social security bureaucracy, I think the latter, that you've been in an abusive relationship and you need to flee an abusive partner, you can legally get a new social security number to protect your identity. And of course they do that in witness protection programs too. If members of the mafia give evidence against another mafia member, they enter the witness protection program, and they're given a new ID and a new social security number. But those are the only legal ways to do it. So that was a big dilemma for me. How was I going to have my two good people in the novel be able to change their ID without committing a felony? That was the point where I thought, I can't do this. I abandoned the novel. And
when did you start it? What year did you start it?
Oh, gosh. Let me think. I think I first I heard this paper about the Tichborne Claimant and read the case of the Brooke Henson, the girl who's in prison in South Carolina, back in about 2008 or 2009. So the idea started then, but it was about a year before I actually started to write anything. So the whole thing took a long time, although from the point where I abandoned it to picked it up again and finished it, that's been the last extremely intense and exhausting year to meet my publisher's deadline.
What made you pick it up again?
The deadline.
Good point.
And I never before have I let myself be trapped into having a deadline, whereas most writers need to get an advance on books before they finish them, and therefore a deadline comes with that. I always felt that would just completely paralyze me, so I have not submitted a book until I had a finished manuscript. This time, for all sorts of reasons that would be too boring and complicated to go into, I felt so encouraged because I'd been so despairing about this book that HarperCollins Australia said, look, we want to do it to have it ready for the Sydney Festival. And from that point on, I was locked into a deadline. I will never do that to myself again.
But you must have thought that there was something in it to take it up again and not start another project.
Well, I tried to start another project. This is what happens. I think, I can't do this. I abandon it. I'm going to do something else. But my mind is not very good at changing gears, at disengaging, and I would try to think about something else. But this damn thing would sort of be in my dreams, and I would be obsessing about it, and I would think, I'd better go back to the damn thing and do something with it. So that's
did you? Was that the time enough for you to see some solutions to some of the problems that you thought you had?
Yes, I would think I would see solutions, and then I would realize that they would run me into more problems and dead ends. I tell you, I have had what I'd have to describe, and I'm sure my husband would confirm, a very severe anxiety disorder for the last few months as I tried to put this thing together and make it work and make it credible. I hope it's credible.
It is absolutely credible, but as I was reading it, I was thinking, I wonder what your study looks like. I imagined that there would be bits of paper everywhere connecting parts of stories and where they cross each other and what does that look like, actually?
In fact, not. I have to work with, I'm a neatness freak. My mind, my brain is always in such an untidy mess with all of these threads going on that I can only work if I'm in a completely neat and ordered study. And I don't make notes along the way. I just keep it all scrambled inside my head and have to try to unscramble it. In high school in Brisbane, and all my longest and intense relationships go back to high school, both with male and female friends. But I was head prefect of the girls, and someone who lived just a couple of blocks away from me was head prefect of the boys. And we would get the train home from school together and walk to the end of his block, and then I would walk on another. He died a few years ago, but he was head of the Biomolecular Institute here at the University of Melbourne. He became a brilliant physicist working on the cutting edge of biomedical research. He and I would probably both get gold medals for frenetic anxiety syndrome. And he once said to me, and it is such an accurate description, I regret to tell you, that I have a mind like the bottom of a bird cage. And that's sort of, somehow I unscramble it in my head without keeping notes or writing outlines or anything like that.
Well, a lot of the book is set in a particular French village. And I must also say that I was always going to Google paintings referred to in the book, because one of the characters it turns out to be an art historian, but has a very particular kind of Jesuitical education in this French village. Tell me about this French village. I feel as if I've been in it now. I've been living in it.
Well,
I was
in
it.
Of course, I changed its location and gave it a fictional name. But my translator in Paris is sort of part of the aristocracy. In fact, she's rather like the Countess in the novel, and she's not a Countess, but it always amused me. She's won the translation prize in the French literary establishment a few times, and she's an incredibly good translator. And for example, when she was translating Oyster, I guess it was, the one set in the Queensland outback, she would call me, she would phone me from Paris because she was a bit bamboozled by the Australian slang. Her English is extremely good, but she wouldn't know what the Australian slang meant, and so she translated it into sort of rural peasant French to keep that sense of slang, that someone on an outback cattle station might use. So she's a very skillful translator. But she lived in what I thought of as a chateau. It was just a big country house in the village that the one she lived in was Saint-Thierry, outside of Reims, just outside of Paris. And so she would invite me to stay with her, and so I experienced gracious living in the style of what in French is called, the class is called BCBG, which stands for Bon Chic, Bon Genre. And it's basically our kind of people, you know, if you come from a certain class. And there is, I guess the equivalent of Burke's peerage for the British world. There is a Dictionnaire de la Noblesse de la France. And whenever some publisher or editor or translator would cross our paths, first thing Marie-Odile would do would be to see if they were in this book. I found it fascinating. So, and she would have these weekend dinner parties of the kind that Lawrence wrote about, that Hermione used to do in England. You know. So I experienced these with the French, and in fact, one of my most embarrassing memories is there was a family, the Masson family, who make champagne in this village, and Marie-Odile, of course, was on very good terms with the Countess, and I was taken on a private tour, which was absolutely fascinating, of this whole champagne-making establishment, and we were given a tasting at the end of this. I was just so nervous that, what did I do? I knocked a glass of champagne all over the Countess. So, and of course, she was completely, immaculately unfazed and polite by this. So I did actually have this experience of what it's like to live in a small French village with a 12th century church and a chateau and very rigid class divisions, you know, between those who are BCBG, you know, of the right kind, of our kind, and who are listed in the Dictionnaire de la Noblesse de la France, and those who aren't. So
but you write about the people outside the wall too.
Well, that's me, you know. I mean, the kind of person who knocks champagne all over the Countess.
But living in the village, in the little sort of tiny little home, and with animals and butchers.
Yeah. Well, I didn't actually experience living in a peasant's home in France, but I did, after all, grow up in one in Brisbane, you know. I mean, blue-collar working class, so I shifted that a bit. But I have a conversation with one of the reporters when they're sent across to find out the village where the heir grew up in, that I did actually have in this village. I used to walk, I love walking, and I would walk around the village pond, and there would be old men, you know, rather nice, interesting-looking old men with their French berets fishing all day long. So I tried valiantly to have conversations with these men because I'm just that kind of person. I talk to everybody. And it was a long time before they would respond at all, you know. And I would ask Marie-Odile, and she said, well, you know, in France, not like Americans. And she'd lived in America, so she knew about this. She said, I can consider it rather invasive and intrusive to be expected to respond to somebody they don't know. But, you know, I was too dumb to realize this and too persistent, and I really wanted to see if my French would work. My French is pretty good. So I would constantly, every day, I would sit by this old man. Finally, one day he spoke to me, and I said, I asked him in French what he called this stretch of water, this little lake, this pond, because there are gazillions of words in French for a lake, a pond, a tarn, etc. So I asked him what he called it, and after a long silence he said, "Je l'appelle un plan d'eau," which is, I call it a piece of water. So I actually put that conversation into the book because I thought it was so funny. But finally I did get them to, I guess they just thought I was some kind of foreign nut, and they had to answer me every once in a while.
Well, there's a lot of politics in this book too, and while we're in France, there's, you know, the question about what happened in those times of Nazi occupation and collaboration, which the French don't often want to talk about.
No, absolutely they don't, because there were collaborators. You know, in the Second World War, within 2 days, France capitulated after the German invasion, and a deal was supposedly worked out where there was Paris in the northwest was under German occupation, and there's a kind of diagonal line, and everything south of that was Vichy France, governed by Vichy, who'd been a general in the First World War, and was supposedly free France, but actually the supposed free French were actually worse in helping the Germans round up all the Jews and deport them. And so, you know, there were collaborators, people who secretly said, I think there are some Jews hiding in that house. And it is still never talked about in France. How I know about that is I actually have a number of Jewish friends in South Carolina who experienced that. You know, I have French Jewish friends in South Carolina. So I learned about that from them. But I always have to, yes, I make things up, but I really have to make sure that I viscerally know the details. I'm not making it up out of fresh air. I have to have known people who worked on cattle farms and who did their own butchering, and I had to know people who got out of occupied France, and I do know them, and I had to actually stay in a little French village with a 12th century church and a chateau. So I do know viscerally those things. In fact, when I wrote Oyster, which is set in the opal fields in outback Queensland, I went back 5 different times because I found there were all kinds of things I felt I didn't know. I knew the rainforested coast of Queensland very well because I grew up there and I taught in far north Queensland when I first went out as a high school teacher. And I thought, I don't know what is mosquito season and fly season in the outback. I have to go and find that out. Well, the answer is fly season is 365 days of the year, and you just can never brush them away. And there aren't often mosquitoes because there's not often water around. You know, it's underground in bore water wells. And that's also when I found out that there are parts of Queensland on bore water where you smell worse after the shower than before it because there's sulfur in the water and you come out smelling of hydrogen sulfide. But you have to have showers. But I always feel I need that kind of visceral, visual, tactile detail before I can write about something.
Well, it's probably about time that you ask some questions now. Yes.
Hi. I was just curious if you ever received any criticisms that have made you almost want to quit being a writer. And
constantly.
And
yes.
What those would be. What criticisms would you have received?
Oh, I'm not going to tell you that. I mean, nobody's going to parade their most embarrassing moments out. Of course, every writer, you have very scathing ones that weren't. In fact, I read with great interest an article in this morning's Australian that I hadn't known about before, that a theatre critic named Catherine Brisbane, 45 years ago, wrote such a scathing review of an actor who produced Othello. I think the last name was O'Shaughnessy or something. Does that ring a bell? I didn't know about the case until I read about it in this morning's paper. And the actor, this happened about 40 years ago, and the actor was he just completely lost his nerve to do any theatre work and went back to Ireland. And there was an interview with the now 82-year-old Catherine Brisbane, have you ever met her?
No.
And way back, she wrote this review in the Australian that just felt like it destroyed the life and the career of this person. And she felt no remorse about it at all, although she did say he should not have taken it so personally, but she said, I was a bit rough, I was a bit scathing, but my feeling was, you should say, because it was a very ad hominem attack. It wasn't just about the work itself. Everybody gets bad reviews, and quite often you more than anyone feel, I know where the holes are in this book. You know, I could write a pretty scathing review of it myself. I'm not going to send out advance notices to tip people off, but there are negative reviews that you feel, yeah, I know that's a weak point, but it's the ones that are ad hominem, ad femininem, that aren't really about the work at all. They're intended to demean and wound the actor or the author. I consider them deeply unethical, and I don't think well of Catherine Brisbane that she, even at this age, is not able to say, that was wrong, it was unethical. But to me it clearly was. Yeah, those happen. You live with them and you don't write anything for quite a while, and then you think, to hell with it, get to work
One more
again.
question, then you have to hand that over to the next person.
Okay. I just wanted to ask also, have you ever started writing a book where you didn't actually know where it was going?
Always. I never know where they're going when I start them. I have, and I would say to my writing students, there's this lengthy period that I call the floundering around period. I mean, I know where I'm going in a very general sense. I knew I was going to write a modern version of the Claimant that everybody thought was a fraud, but perhaps wasn't. I'm not going to give away the end of the novel. So in that very, very general sense, you know, I knew where I was heading. But what's going to happen along the way? It's like having one of those Eurail passes from London to Rome, and you can get off wherever you want and stay for as long as you want. The actual route I find out in the writing. In fact, one of my favorite quotes is from one of my favorite American novelists, E.L. Doctorow, who has said, "I write to find out what it is I will have written." I feel like that too.
Yes, at the back.
Thank you for your very compassionate comments and for raising the issue of ethics. You talk about your French translator with a great deal of warmth and generosity of spirit. I'm reminded as counterpoint of Patrick White, who had a reputation of befriending people in order to, find out about the Jewish community in order to write a book, and then would drop them and often be very mean-spirited about them in retrospect. How do you, as a writer who keeps on writing, take details from friends, family, people that you may be close to, and yet not diminish or demean your friendship and your relationship with them? And what are the ethics of what you can and can't write along those lines?
I have very strong ethical feelings about this, and about preserving the privacy of people who've shared intimate and painful things with you, and certainly not embarrassing them. And I still have a very warm relationship with my translator, who, mind you, hasn't yet read this book and doesn't yet know what it's about. It's never just, a character in a book is never just one person, although there are aspects of my translator in the Countess in this book. I so disguise things, and the safest disguise of all generally is to actually change the gender of the person whose emotional life or experiences you may be writing about, and that's one of my devices. And I say this to my students because there's stuff in their family background they want to write about, but how do they do it without violating privacy or hurting people? And I say the safest way of all is to change the gender of the character you're writing about. I have many times, I've actually never had someone say, you used my life. They don't, I think I make pretty sure that they might recognize themselves, but nobody else will. But I have many, many times had people whom I did not faintly or remotely have in mind as a character say to me, "I told you that story, didn't I? You wrote about my life." So, I mean, we all identify with characters in books, but I've never had anyone who I actually partly had in mind the character get upset. Maybe they notice, but it hasn't changed their relationship with me. I do think it's an ethical imperative, not to wound and not to violate privacy, and certainly not to violate confidences that you've been told. I wish that were true of everybody. I certainly wish it were true of critics. Does that answer it? Okay.
Another question. Well, it's my turn again then.
Okay.
Sometimes I was in the chateau in France. I was imagining I was actually in a painting, when the way you describe it. It's almost seemed like another dimension I was walking into.
Glad, because, you know, I've visited most of the major chateaux along the Loire Valley, and my favourite is Chenonceau, which was built by Henry IV for one of his mistresses, and then when the king died, the queen kicked the mistress out and took it over herself. But I do love these chateaux. The architecture is extraordinary. I especially love Chambord, which Francois Ier had built and had Da Vinci design a double spiral staircase. You know, it's sort of, well, it's like DNA, actually, what actually came to be the DNA spiral. So I have spent a lot of time in a number of French chateaux, just purely as a besotted tourist and admirer of this beautiful architecture and these beautiful tapestries and these amazing paintings. And all the paintings I describe in detail are in the art museum in Tours, which is the nearest city to the chateau of the Loire Valley. But also, Cliff and I recently have paid, I don't know if they're available here, called The Great Courses, where you get a series of DVDs. And
I've seen them advertising.
Famous art historians or lecturers in their field. And you get these great, you know, it's taught me to look at paintings the way art historians look at them, and note the gestures, I suppose you'd say, that have passed historically from one painter to another. So I was training myself in art history while I was writing this. We also, I must say, we got the course on philosophy lectures, so I think we've never got past the third disc on that. We found that a bit heavy going. But the art ones are great because there's always a painting on the screen that's being analysed and dissected for you. So that was a big help as I was writing about the paintings.
So the other angle to that sort of Comtesse is that she's got a great deal of Catholic religious fervour, like the Tichborne Claimant's mother.
Yeah.
And of course your family were fundamentalist Pentecostals.
Right.
I think that's where...
Yeah.
So is that where you got the fervour from?
Yes, I understand religious intensity because I grew up with it. So I also understood the son and heir's desire to distance himself from that. I initially made all kinds of errors in Catholic Mass and theology and in the Rosary. I mean, I always thought not being Catholic, in fact, being taught that, as my parents, who were very gentle, loving parents, and I always told my dad, you know, you're a kind and gentle man in the teeth of your dogma, because the theological underpinnings were pretty strict. And my parents used to say that they thought that some Catholics were Christians in spite of their superstition and their idols. And so
what were Pentecostals? What sort of flavour of Christianity was
that? Well, it's very evangelical Protestantism. It's sort of the intense. It's like the Hasidim, or it's the intense, mystical, spiritual end of Protestantism. So intensity, I understood, but I made all kinds of errors. I knew rosaries had decades. Well, I always thought that the decade was every 10th bead. Well, hands up all the Catholics in the room. Luckily, I had my editor, this was just pure good luck because I would have mortified myself. I wouldn't have realised that my editor in Sydney is Australian Irish Catholic. So what I found out is every 11th bead is the decade, and when you get to the 11th bead, you say an Our Father, and there are 10 beads between each of the decades. So I made all kinds of really ignorant errors in the first draft that luckily for me were corrected.
See, we haven't even covered all of the different areas in which that Janette Turner Hospital has to become expert in order to write this book. But there are many areas.
Yeah, which is sort of what made me think this book will kill me. I didn't really set out intending to have to find out so much about everything from the dates of the Second World War, the dates of the Vietnam War. I had to know you know, when the last draftees were sent, when the last Australians and Americans were out of Vietnam. I knew the fall of Saigon was 75, but in fact, in case you ever need to know it, in Trivial Pursuit or Jeopardy, the last Australians and Americans were actually out of Vietnam by 72. And the only people left for the fall of Saigon were the embassy staff and the CIA. So I had to find out much more than I ever intended or wanted to know about those kinds of dates and cutting up beef and rosaries. And
But look, Matt, can I reassure you and assure you that Janette Turner Hospital is a fine writer, and you won't see any sort of list of things that you need to remember, or you know, all the knowledge is beautifully wrapped up together and presented as a completely compelling story. But please thank her for being with us this morning.